So, Winona, you were in a leadership position at the GBTA in, I think, what we could say historically was a really very unique time. You were president, if I'm correct, when we had a global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So, um, I think one of the experiences that you've had that we'll want to remember and be able to look back on is what it was like. So maybe you could describe a bit, that experience starting from when things first hit the news early in that year 2020, and then kind of how that played out, being in the leadership of the school system, which was so deeply impacted.
Yeah, so what is the year? Was it 2019 in the spring that
It was 2020.
when the schools closed down
Yeah, yeah, and it was the lockdown happened in March
of
of
2020?
2020.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So I was definitely president. It was my first year as being the president, and but I was working with Jason, who was the past president. I think he must have been contract chair that year. And at spring break, there was the big decision about whether or not to go away. And Jason went to Hawaii, and I went up to the Sunshine Coast. And then everything closed down, and it was we were pre-Zoom, we were figuring out how to manage that, and I was having these conference calls with the superintendent, the associate superintendent, all spring break. What do we do? And a little different. Often you're at odds with the school district, but there was a sense of none of us really knew what to do. There wasn't a ton of direction. The direction kept changing. Are we going back to school? Does school look like anything? What's going to happen? Sort of pushing back, but I didn't feel like the pressure was coming from the district to get everybody was reacting to the pandemic and just trying to figure out how to answer people's questions, and what do we do with people who are outside of the country now and who are struggling to get back, and if we're going back online, can they teach if they're outside of the country? Can they there were just so many unanswered questions.
So just for some context, yeah, that period of time things were one after another shutting down. So first it was some businesses shut down. I remember our AGM got canceled.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And
I got my nails painted red, and then I was like, well, never going to see people again.
And then gradually transportation, yeah. So
yes.
Teachers might have gone off and then not been able to come back because planes weren't going.
There were lots of teachers. It's not unusual for teachers to leave the country over a spring break, or not even the country, but just leave their home.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was lots of challenges with people contacting, being like, I want to come back. And our whole working conditions changed, because then gradually by the end of April, if I recollect, we were looking at online teaching. So what does that look like for people who are on leave that couldn't be working during their current conditions but could work under those conditions, or other people where it really didn't make sense at all for them to be working anymore. So there was just a lot of unknowns to deal with. We dealt with so many accommodations, whether it was childcare accommodations or elder care accommodations or medical accommodations were certainly the largest, and it really seemed to hinge on the leadership at the school. Our district did have leadership at the time, but I would say that some of the principals really stepped up and really accommodated their staff and set up situations so that children of essential workers could be in the schools, and the teachers who could be there, whether because of health conditions or whatever, the ones that couldn't be there were accommodated. Some of the schools did that really, really well, and others were terrible at it, and it was really hard to get some sort of overall plan from the district. It was
so the role of the union really changed quite a bit. I mean, we went from the routine of a school year and the usual kind of, staffing and other kind of events that the union has a big part in, to this really intense focus on health and safety and organization of teaching under conditions where the schools closed and then partially reopened and reopened with different rules. So what was that like, having to be the person kind of looking at how the union does its job defending members and our rights in that context? That must have been really challenging.
It was very stressful. And you're kind of like also doing it all on your own at home. So, although, Carolyn and Robin were both in positions and I could not have done it without their support. But as you know, when you're the president, sort of it falls to you, some of those decisions. And we were meeting weekly with the BCTF. So we'd have conference calls with the BCTF every week, which were, I guess, helpful and sort of painful. We get an update on whatever they could share, and then every local would give a little blurb on what was happening on a phone call, and then people not muting their phones and all of the fascinating things that can happen around that. And then I was holding at least weekly meetings with staff reps, often elementary, middle, and high school, because the situations in all three were very different. High schools were basically going online, depending on the capacities of the teachers. That seemed to go quite well. One of the big issues was just technology and making sure that students were able to access, and of course we saw that socioeconomic play out very differently school to school. Middle school seemed to manage sort of a hybrid, but again, it's a lot easier for middle school kids to be at home and accommodated, but elementary schools it was really hard because those school kids needed to be in school. Lots of parents weren't in a position to be able to have their kids at home, either for a variety of reasons, but that was definitely the most challenging. So tailoring, I wrote lengthy updates, health and safety updates, and then would give reports online, which is a real pivot. Now it seems kind of normal. We meet on Zoom so often, but then it was a big shift to not be able to be face to face with the folks that you're talking to read their body language and find out what's really happening for them. And working really long hours and meeting with the superintendent, I'd say on an almost daily basis, trying to problem solve and talk things through, because the situation changed constantly, whether or not we were supposed to wear masks, was it a bubble, should we be looking at quarter systems? There were so many changes so quickly. The updates from Dr. Bonnie Henry constantly going on, and then the level of distrust that rose around it, and whether or not we were going to get vaccinated, and all of the political issues. It was
so what were some of those? What were some of those issues? What were the things that teachers felt frustrated about?
Vaccinations, for sure. I didn't find, I think we're lucky in Victoria, it's pretty progressive, so I didn't have teachers really resistant in the same way about getting vaccinated as I heard from some of our colleagues from across the province that were dealing with a different situation. But we certainly real anxiety to get vaccinated and not seeing those vaccines come out quickly enough, so that felt like a huge issue. Masks were huge, and air quality, HVAC systems, getting those updated, making sure that the air quality was in the room. Things like just keep your windows open as it got into winter was obviously not sufficient to just have windows open, and yet lots of the HVAC systems in the schools not being equipped to have the better filters. All these words that I never thought I'd have to know about.
How did teachers respond? Were there staffs that just took things into their own hands because they were frustrated? Did that?
Different schools have very different cultures, and some schools seemed so calm, and a lot of it came down to the leadership. There were some, and not just the leadership, I'd say, from the administration, but also leadership from staff reps at schools. Some of them were very organized and advocating, and their staff felt safe because they felt like they were fully informed. I think the high schools did better, but they had to be in person so much less, so that was easier. Very interesting time.
And it lasted quite a while. That following school year, I remember there was still a lot of difference in
Right.
terms of what teaching meant, and how that impacted the job. What were some other impacts on the union, would you say? I mean, our own structures changed quite a bit during that period of time.
Hard to figure out even how to manage the office, right? Okay, so teachers go back to work. They're required to be in classrooms. Do we require our office staff? Do we require the folks who are seconded to be in the office? How do you navigate those things? That was interesting. And I think we managed that, but all of a sudden you're having to think about, well, how are our conditions here different, or are they the same, or should we be replicating that? And just, I felt like, well, if teachers have to be on site, we should have to be on site too, but you also want some flexibility in that. And I don't know, that was a challenge. Heading back to schools when the province said that school would go back late and there would be mandatory health and safety training, so that's great. But then they didn't say that for teachers teaching on call, and we ended up having to go through the grievance process to have the teachers paid to do the mandatory training that they required to be able to report to the work site. And just some disputes with the district that I thought, like, why are we having a dispute over that? Just pay all of your employees to do the training and let's get on with it. Things like, I mean, we weren't successful in the grievance where they invited everybody to attend meetings in the summer about what school would look like when we came back in the fall. But of course, people are heavily invested in our collective agreement language suggests that you get paid even if you're volunteering to attend a meeting. But because of the exceptional circumstances of a pandemic, we kept hearing things from arbitrators like, well, these are exceptional circumstances. And that's an interesting place to be in. We were very successful with all of our accommodation grievances, but it was a lot of those processes to go through too, and trying to figure out all of those additional pieces that you never, like, you don't have any past grievances to rely on and be like, okay, this is how this has been settled before, we can just go forward on this. Instead, we had to kind of make it up, and the BCTF was making it up as we went along. There's no case law about it, there's no rulings out there where you can just rely on, like, this is what you do in these cases. So it did seem to come down to how hard you push it. Luckily, we've got a good history of that here. So.
Well, in some ways, it's kind of like going back to, you know, the early days of union organizing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like, what are you willing to do to make sure your rights are met? Yeah.
Yeah, felt like we had to fight everything.
Yeah, I know the BCTF AGM went online, and I'm thinking about bargaining as well, because we were
in
without
bargaining.
a contract, right? When COVID. So how did that play out in the pandemic?
I think actually it probably worked out okay for us. Would we have gotten a better deal if the pandemic had never happened then? I think we would have ended up in job action at that. I think everybody felt like, oh, we've got a bigger thing to deal with in that particular round, and kind of wrapped it up pretty quickly, because we were doing all of the, like, I'd been out visiting schools doing Red for Ed, and we had lots of, like, motivational things happening, sort of preparing for if things got spicy at the bargaining table. And then the pandemic hit, and it kind of was like, okay, let's wrap this up. And I don't even really have a clear recollection of what we got at the bargaining table that round. I think we made some modest improvements, but it really got eclipsed by the pandemic.
Anything else before we move on from that period of time that was memorable, or?
I just really been thankful for the team that I had to work with here. It was hard. I actually felt less connected to our overall executive than I had before, because when you're only seeing people every 2 weeks or twice a month, and the only time is at the EC table, that's sort of how you form that connection. But for the other folks in release positions that I was working with all the time trying to solve this, I just can't imagine how I would have done it without them. Things like literally writing speeches as I was giving them to the board. Definitely some entertaining where I was like, you are changing the thing I'm saying as I'm saying it. And I know that Carolyn and Robin were in the other room sort of like, is she just gonna say this if we change it? And I did, like I'd read it before. And so, but really, like, thankful to have a team to go through that all with. It would have been impossible. doing it totally on your own.
And I guess one last question, just thinking about, so we're sort of 5 years on now. Like, do you think that the union is stronger in some ways? One of the things I think about is just health and safety, and what how that just came to the surface as an issue that, was always there, but not sort of in the foreground in the same way. Do you have a sense of how, like, we transformed as an organization going through that experience?
I think people don't put up with as much as they did. And that's been good and bad for the organization. I think it creates some challenges, but there was something like you kind of had to advocate for yourself, and in a different way. And I do feel like people are like more interested in working part-time, more interested in making sure their work site is safe. I think it opened up this idea of, I could be doing other things than just working, because up until the pandemic really felt like what teachers wanted was full-time continuing work. The majority of teachers were working towards full-time continuing work, and even if that work was hard, that was the goal. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think lots of people are like, how can I work a part-time contract that really gives me some work-life balance? And so that's shifted our relationship, and I think shifted the way people get involved with the union. Although lately I've been seeing a different shift again, where there's a lot of new activists who are really engaged, and it's kind of exciting. The RA had a lot of new folks there, which were pretty quiet because it's the fall RA and they're new, but I don't think they'll be quiet for long. I think they were just getting a feel for it.
Sounds great.